Hey everybody, welcome back to Garage Band Guitarist, and we're going to do a lesson today on theory. So we're not going to learn anything new on playing our guitar today, but we're just going to give you some more material that's going to help you understand what's going on with what you're playing. And we're going to use this stuff throughout the rest of the course, so it's very important. This is not something I would consider to be optional in any way, so I'm marking it as an actual lesson here, and this will really be helpful as we move into the next few lessons and we're learning different kinds of chords, and we really want to understand what's happening with those chords and how they're constructed. So we need to do a little bit more on this basic music theory, music structure kind of issue. This builds off of what I called preliminary lesson number 2, which was called naming notes and strings. So if you're confused in any way by what I'm saying in here, and I seem to be assuming something you don't know, you might want to go back and revisit that lesson. I called it optional too, so if you skipped it and things don't seem like they're totally making sense in this one, maybe you better go back and see it. It was kind of optional if you didn't already know it, basically. So go back and watch that one if you're feeling a little confused as we get through this. But I don't think you'll find this material too difficult. It's pretty straightforward. But this is going to be a little bit of a longer lesson because I want to make sure that I'm explaining this stuff very clearly to you, and it's something that you need to take forward with you into the rest of the lessons. If you have prior music experience, you were in the band in high school or something, or choir, this stuff might be something you know, but I'm going to say probably not, because some of the material in here they would talk about in band or something, but some of it they often don't. They just kind of let it be, and you play the notes on the page, and they don't really talk about the structure of what's behind it. But that kind of thing is more important when you're playing the guitar than when you're just playing notes off a page in the band or singing notes off a page in a choir. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time with it. There's only going to be, this is the second theory lesson in the course, and there's going to be one more later on that's going to take it to the next step beyond what we're going to cover here. But that's about it for the course, and that's all you really need to operate well in this garage band guitar kind of space, okay? Now, so before I launch into the material in this one, let me just remind you of a couple of things from the prior lesson. I won't go into detail, but just to remind you. First of all, I just want us to remember the basic layout of the letters of the notes, A through G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then it repeats, keeps going, A, B again, all the way through. And then that there's these kind of notes in between some of those letters. There's an additional note in between some of those letters, and we call those sharps or flats, depending on whether you're naming the note on the basis of the note that's lower than it or the note that's higher than it. So if you're talking about the note that's in between A and B, if you're naming it on the basis of the note that's lower than it, the A, you'd call it A and a little bit higher, sharp. That's what sharp means, is higher, okay? And then if you're naming it on the basis of the note that's a little bit above it, the B, then you'd say B flat, flat meaning going lower, okay? And so I've got this laid out on the screen again just so you can remember that sequence of notes, okay? And we went over all that in the other lesson. If you want to review it and see how it maps onto the guitar neck, it's in that preliminary lesson number 2. The other thing that's important to know for this lesson is the names of the strings, and I really want you to memorize those. It'll be very helpful to you, but just to remind you, and again, it's covered in that preliminary material, the lowest string is E, then A, then D, then G, then B, and then E. And the E is 2 octaves higher than the low one. It's the same note, just higher, okay? So E, A, D, G, B, E. You're back up to the E, all right? When we're playing these on the guitar neck, those are the notes that you tune the strings to, but there's a relationship between the notes as you go up the frets and the strings. Okay, so if you start on the E string and you start going up half steps, just like you would using that little diagram we had, the next note is F. There's not an extra note in between the E and the F. So E, then F, then F sharp, then G, that's the 3rd fret, and then G sharp, and then A. So we've gone up 5 frets, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're back to it, we're on an A. And that's the note of the next string. Now I'm playing that one open. So that's the same note. 5th fret on this string, open on the next string. And that relationship goes through the string. So if we go up on the A string, we go A, A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D. We're on the 5th fret, we're playing a D, and that's the open note on the next string, the D string, right? And then the same thing happens as you go up the D string. D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G on the 5th fret. We're on the 5th fret of the D string. We're playing a G, and that's the open of the next string, G. Now there's one exception to that little rule of 5 frets, and that's on the G string, okay? On the G string, you only go up 4 frets to get to the next string note. So on G, we're G, G sharp, A sharp, B. So I'm only on the 4th fret, and I'm already up to the note of the next string. That's B. The open of the next string is B. Okay? Now, that's just one of those little quirks with guitar that you just have to get used to, and it causes confusion and things with other things that we're going to do, but it just has to be for a couple of reasons, that somewhere in this you've got to have one movement from one string to the next that's only 4 frets instead of 5 frets, okay? And by convention, it just happens to be the one that's the G going to the B string. So just 4 frets to get to the B note. G, G sharp, A sharp, B. 4th fret, B is the next one, okay? And then the last one, you're back to 5 frets. So you start with B open, and you go C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E. And that's the open of the next string. Okay? That's a method you can use to tune the guitar too. If you know you've got your low E string, for example, in tune, well, you just play the A on the 5th fret, and then you match the string next to it to that note. Move it up and down till it matches that fret, and you can tune your guitar that way. You can do that all the way. Even on the G string, just play the B note on the 4th fret, and you match the string to it, and you can tune your guitar that way. Okay? So just wanted to remind you of all that. You don't need to memorize every single one of those notes. Oh, you know, F sharp, E, F sharp, G, G sharp, A. You don't have to just, memorize that all. It's a good thing to learn, but you can get by without it. But I just want you to understand that concept, because we're going to be finding notes in this area of the neck as we learn our chords. And so it's a good thing to at least be able to figure out that this note up here is a D, because I'm on the B string. So B, C, C sharp, D. We want to be able to figure out that that's a D note, okay? The more you learn them, the better off you're going to be. That's great. Later on, we're going to do a little bit of lesson on how to memorize the whole neck board. But I just want you to be aware of that little system of locating notes in these first 5 frets and how the strings are related to each other, okay? All right. So let's launch into the material here for this lesson. And the first thing we want to understand is scales. What is a scale? Well, a scale, you've heard of musical scales before, I'm sure. What's a scale? Well, it's a pattern of notes that usually go across an octave. That's a scale, okay? So, and so it's just a set of notes as we go from one A to the next A, or the next higher A, or the G to the G, whatever. It's some sort of pattern of notes in between those octave notes. That's what a scale is. Usually, almost always, it's a pattern of half steps and whole steps, okay? So you'll have a half step and a whole step up, and then another half step, and then a whole step and a whole step and a whole step and a half step, or something. It's some kind of sequence of moving up whole steps and half steps. And recall that on the guitar, a half step is one fret. So each one of these moves is a half step, and a whole step is two half steps. So it's two frets. Okay, so I just did one whole step and then a half step, and then another whole step. Okay, and so some kind of pattern of whole steps and half steps is what makes a scale. Okay, so for example, a major scale starts with the root note, whatever we're calling the scale, E or A or G, whatever note we're starting on. Okay, it starts with that root note, and then it goes up. From there, it goes up a whole step, and then a whole step, then a half step, then a whole step, another whole step, and then a half step, and that gets you back to the same note that you were on, just higher, one octave higher. Okay, so that's what a major scale is. It's defined by that pattern of root, then whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Okay, that's what a major scale is. The major scale is super important, and it's one that you already know. I am absolutely positive you already know it. If you were in band or choir or something, you warmed up playing a major scale or singing a major scale just about every single class you ever went to. Okay, but for the rest of us, it's the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do sequence. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That's the major scale, okay? And you all know it from The Sound of Music or whatever. You've heard that scale, that sequence of notes, that do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And that is what I'm singing there, is I'm starting with my root note, whatever that is, do, and then I'm going up a whole step, re, and then another whole step, mi, and then a half step, so, and so on, up the scale, all right? And that's how it works, okay? That's a major scale. And like I said, I'm sure you're probably familiar with that sequence of notes because we hear it so much in our music. Now, there's other patterns of whole steps and half steps that produce other scales, okay? So this isn't the only scale. That's the major scale that we're dealing with there. But there's other kinds of scales. We're not going to cover those. We're not going to really deal with those in this course. But just so you know that that's not the only pattern of whole steps and half steps, obviously, that's available. And other ones form other scales, okay? All right. Now, if we start on a C note, let's do that. Let's start on a C note. That's our do. Do. What's the C here? C. That's a C. Do, do. Okay, so that's our first note. That's our root note in our scale. And so if we do that with C, then the C major scale looks like this. Okay, so I have it mapped onto the root, and then the whole step up to a D, another whole step up to an E, a half step up to an F, because there's nothing between that E and F, another whole step up to G, a whole step up to A, one more whole step up to B, and then I've got another half step that gets me back to C, okay? That's the eighth note in the scale, the octave, okay? All right, that's a C major scale. And it just so happens I picked out C on purpose because C is the one that there's no sharps or flats in. It's the only major scale that lines up that way, where there's no flats and no sharps. And so it's kind of an easy one to start with and illustrate. If you're thinking about the piano, those of you who know the piano, it's all the white notes. So if you start on a C on the piano, you just play the white notes going up, and it'll be C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and that'll be a sequence of whole step, whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Okay, so it's the white keys on the piano, and there's no sharps or flats in that particular major scale because you're starting on C. Okay, but you can do that whole step, half step thing with any of our notes, any of our scales. You can start on any note and you build above that with the whole step, half step pattern, and you'll get another major scale, okay, just starting on a different note. So let's do E, for example, okay? If we were starting on E down here, we would have the pattern that we need is E, then go up a whole step above E is F sharp, another whole step is G sharp, a half step then is the next thing we need. That gets us to A, and then a whole step to B. A whole step up from B is C sharp. A whole step up from C sharp is D sharp, and then a half step from D sharp up is E, and we've got back to the octave. So E, whole step, 2 frets, F sharp, G sharp, whole step, A, half step, B, whole step, C sharp, whole step, D sharp, whole step, and then I'm back to E. And it's the same pattern. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Okay? And that's the E major scale. That's the E major scale. All right? Now, here comes a very important part of this. Okay? We also refer to the notes in the scale by numbers. Okay, this is very, very important because it's going to help us understand chords. Okay, this is very important. So, and it's obviously very simple. Here's the same setup. Okay, so the root note is 1, and then each note, you just count them up as you go up. Okay, so root is 1, the second note is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way up to your octave, right? All right, so the do is 1, the re is 2, and so on. The root note is 1, you go up a whole step, that's 2, and so on, right? So those numbers correspond to the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and to that pattern of whole notes, whole steps and half steps, okay? Now let's put our our C major scale back in there so we can understand its relationship to these numbers. So in the key of C, since we're starting on C, C is our 1 note, obviously. D is our 2, up a whole step. From C is D. Then E is up another whole step from D. Okay, so that's our 3 note. A half step up from there is F. That's our 4 note, and so on. All right, so G is the 5th, A is the 6th, B is the 7th, and then C, we're back to 8. Okay, and so that's how we number the notes in the major scale. Okay, that's very important. Now, the reason it's so important is that we use those numbers to define what are called intervals between notes. Okay, an interval is the distance between notes. Okay, maybe that's obvious, but I'll just say it because sometimes music vocabulary can be a little obscure, okay, and so sometimes things seem like they could be obvious, but they're really not, okay. So that interval is the distance between notes. So for example, F is the 4th note in the C major scale. So we call that distance, that interval, a 4th. Okay, so from C to F is called a 4th because F is the 4th note. From C to D is called a 2nd because you're only going to the 2nd note in the scale, right? From C to A is a 6th, okay, because we're going to the 6th note of the scale. And C to B is a 7th, and so they all have that kind of correspondence, okay, to these numbers. Now, these intervals have some more specific names associated with them, and we're going to get to that later, so you don't need to know that right now. Let's just deal with the numbers and keep the numbers in our mind, knowing that it's the number the note is in the major scale. The eighth interval is got a special name, the octave. I've already been using that, and we've talked about that a number of times. So it has that special name, octave. Nobody goes around talking about the eighth interval. They call it the octave. Okay, so we've already discussed that, but just so you know, that particular name for the eighth interval is the octave. Nobody says eighth. Okay. And this just actually keeps going, okay? So once you get past the octave, there's still an interval between the first note and the next note, okay? So if you go up to that D that's above the higher C, we're going through the C scale, and we get up to C, we get up to the octave, and then we go one further, the distance between that D and the first C that we were at is 9 notes, right? We've gone one more past the 8, and that's called a ninth, and it keeps going. Okay. Now you don't use a lot of those when you get higher up on the intervals, but they are there, and sometimes they do come up. All right. Now, why are intervals so important? Intervals are important because they define chords. Okay. So we've taught you a few chords already. But what chords are really are their sequences of intervals, right? So for example, a major chord is made up of the root, the 1, and the 3rd, and the 5th. That's what makes a major chord. A C, the 3rd note of the scale, an E, and the 5th note of the scale, a G. So you've got the first note, then you've got a 3rd, getting up to the E, you've got that note, that interval, and then you've got that interval from C to G, the 5th. And those 3 notes make up the C major chord, okay? Now, usually you have to have at least 3 notes for something to be called a chord, okay? Now, they can have more than 3. They can have 4, 5, 6. I mean, some chords are very complicated, but they've got to have at least 3 to call it a chord. If it's just 2 notes, it's called an interval, okay? Now, people love to point this out, purists. If somebody accidentally calls 2 notes a chord, you know, the purists will jump all over you in the comments of your YouTube video or something. And, you know, it's one of those things that people kind of perseverate over. But you know, in reality, you know, technically, you got to have 3, so they're right. You got to have 3 to have a chord. But there are instances where just 2 notes are treated as a chord, okay? And because in the context that they're in, they kind of imply a 3rd note. And that kind of 2-note chord, if you will, is very important in rock and pop music. And we're going to get to that later on in the course. It's a very important concept. But be careful because if you accidentally call 2 notes a chord, somebody might get on your case a little bit, okay? All right, now let's go back to our major chord, okay? The root, the 3rd, and the 5th. That's the major chord. So we call that root the 1 a lot of the time. So people will say 1, 3, 5. And they mean the root, the 3rd, and the 5th. That's what makes up the major chord. I said in the C scale, in the C chord, it's C, E, and G. So that's the 1, 3, 5 for C, but the 1, 3, 5 applies in any major scale, all right? So whatever note we start on, we go up a 3rd and a 5th, and we put the root, the 3rd, and the 5th together, and we get the major chord for that scale, okay? For that major scale. So let's put the E back up here for a second. And our root note is E, that's our 1. The 3rd in the E major scale is G sharp. And then the 5th is B, right? And so those are the 3 notes. That's our 1, 3, 5 for the key of E. That's our major triad, E, G sharp, and B, all right? And so those are the notes that we'll need when we want to play an E chord, okay? All right. As I said in an earlier lesson, major chords sound happy. You know, they sound bright and, you know, uplifting, I guess you'd say, okay? That's an E major chord. And compare that to the E minor chord, the minor variant, which sounds more sad. Right? D major chord. Kind of happy sounding. D minor chord. More sad. Okay? And those differences are really important because they form really two different, completely different classes of chords. It's a very important distinction, and we build up other chords and scales on the basis of that fundamental difference. So it's not just two different chords, they're two different kind of realms of chords and scales in music, and they're very important in defining how our music progresses. So minor and major chords aren't just a small thing, they're a real big sort of categorization scheme in music as well. Okay? All right. One quick note on notation. When we want to indicate a major chord, we use just the letter, right? So if you just see written down in music somewhere, it says G, it means that you're going to play the major chord, right? We just use the letter. If we're going to do something else, there'll be something behind it. But if you just see a C or you just see a D, that means to play the major chord. That's what it means, okay? We don't write out G major or say G major all the time. We just use the letter, okay? When you play these chords on a guitar, you don't have to play the chord in the order of the triad, the 1, 3, 5. You don't have to play them in that order. You just have to make sure all those notes, the 1, 3, and the 5, you have to make sure they're all in there in your chord somewhere. Okay, they've all got to be there for it to be the major chord. And you can't have anything else. Otherwise, it's not a major chord anymore. Now, there's things you can add. You can add on top of those three notes, the 1, 3, 5, but that's a different chord, and you have to call it something different, and it sounds different, okay? But for just playing the major chord, you have to have them all in there, but nothing else. You can't add anything else on top of it, okay? Like example, okay? The C chord. The C chord is made up, we've already said, of the root 1, the C note, the third E, and the fifth G. C, E, G. Those are the three notes that we have to have, and nothing else, in order to have a C chord, a C major chord, okay? So if we put our chord chart back up here and how we're playing it on our guitar, we can just check that out, all right? Let's just see. This is the C chord I taught you. And again, you'll notice at the bottom of the chord chart, I've got the note that's actually being produced on each string at the bottom here. So let's starting with the lowest note. That's an open E string. That's an E, okay? And then the next string, we're playing a C note because we're on the A string and we've gone up A flat, B, C. So that's a C note. The next one, we're playing an E, right? Because we're on the D string, we're up 2 frets, that's an E. Then we've got an open G, the note we tuned that one to. On the B string, we're up 1 fret, right? The one we're playing with our index finger, that's a C note. And then we've got another open E. Our top string is open, right? So, and those are the notes in the C triad. C, E, and G. So we've covered them all in our chord, and we don't have anything else except E's, C's, and G's in the chord. Now you'll notice they're not in the order. The lowest note isn't C. We don't go C, E, G. It doesn't matter. Okay, as long as we've got them all in there, we're good. Okay, they don't have to be in order. All right, let's do the two other major chords that we've learned, okay? First one, G, okay? Let's do G, all right? And so this is our chord chart for G, and it just going down the strings again. The lowest string, we're up 3 frets on the E string, so that's a G note. Then we're playing a B on the A string, we're up 2 frets, that's a B. And then we got D open, G open, B open, and then we've got another G up on our highest string. And those are the three notes that are in a G major chord. The triad is G, B, and D. And that's all we have in there. We have all G's, B's, and D's, and we've got G's, B's, and D's in the chord. So we've got our G major chord. We're good, okay? The other one we learned is D, okay? In D, in the key of D, the triad is the root D, the 1 is the D, F sharp is the 3, and then A is the 5th, okay? So we've got D, F sharp, and A. Those are the notes we need. Here's our chord chart, how we played it. We're blocking that first string, so that one's not getting played. The next string, the next lowest string, the A string is open, A, and then we've got a D. A and D are both in our chord. We need D, A, and F sharp, okay? And then the next one, we're playing another A, okay, with our index finger on the G string. We're playing that up 2 frets, so that's an A. And then we've got a D on our B string. We're up 3 frets there. And then we still haven't gotten an F sharp yet. We've got A's and D's so far. So then on the top string, we're playing on the 2nd fret, and that's an F sharp. All right, so now we've got our 3 notes, D, A, and F sharp, and we've got nothing else because we're blocking this lower one from playing. So we've got a nice D major chord. Okay, so there it is. All right. Okay, so that's how major chords map onto this concept of intervals. Okay, and it's very important to keep in mind. And now we're going to use that to help us understand what a minor chord is. Okay, minor chord construction is very, very similar to the major chord construction. There's just a tiny, tiny difference in these two things. It's the smallest difference you can actually imagine, okay? It's only one note. We're going to change a half step, which is the smallest amount you can change in when you're going through the notes in music, right? A half step is the smallest change that you can make, and we're only going to move one note like that. That's a tiny little difference, but it produces these two totally different worlds of chords and music structure, okay, by doing just that one tiny little thing. So this is very important to understand and follow this concept, okay? So what we're going to do, it's simple, it's very simple, is we're going to change the 3, the 3rd, in that major chord. We're going to change it to something else. And what we're going to do is we're going to drop it down a half step, okay? So instead of playing the 1, 3, 5, we're going to play the 1, 3, 5, but the 3 is going to be a half step lower, right? So for example, in our C major chord, our triad was C, E, G, right? And so now we're going to take that 3rd, the E, and we're going to drop it down a half step to E flat. So our triad, our minor triad, is now going to be C, E flat, G instead of C, E, G, right? And so what's going on here is that there's just actually 2 versions of the 3rd interval. There's 2 versions of it, and it won't shock you to learn. They're called the major 3rd and the minor 3rd, okay? And the minor 3rd, obviously, is the one that's dropped down a half a step, right? And so there's 2 versions of that 3rd. Major 3rd, which we use in the major chord in the major scale, and the minor 3rd, which we use in the minor chord, right? That's it. You do that, and you've got your 2 variants of your chord, C minor and C major, okay? When we write a minor chord, we just usually put a lowercase m next to it, or a lowercase min. You'll see that as well, okay? But usually just a lowercase m is what you'll see. All right? All right, now let's go back and think for a second about the 2 minor chords that we've learned so far, E minor and A minor. Those are the 2 chords that you've already got command over on your guitar. An E major chord, and we had that scale up here. The E major chord is made up of E, G sharp, and B. That's the 1, 3, 5 in the E major chord, okay? But to get an E minor, we've got to drop that G sharp in the middle. We've got to drop that down a half step to G, okay? So the three notes in the E minor triad are E, G, and B. E, G, and B, instead of E, G sharp, and B, which would give you the major triad, okay? So let's go back to our chord chart again. This is our E minor chord. And let's just look at this and see what we've got in this chord, okay? So we've got an open E down here on the bottom. Then we've got a B. We're playing on the 2nd fret on the A string, so that's a B. And then we've got another E on the D string, up 2 frets. We've got an open G, and then we've got an open B and an open E. Okay? That's our E minor chord, and you can see we've got all the 3 notes we need, E, G, and B, and we don't have anything else, so we've got an E minor chord. Okay? That's E minor. An A major triad is A, C sharp, and E. And if you went through and figured out your whole step, half step thing, you would discover that those are the 3 notes, the 1, 3, 5, in an A major triad, A, C sharp, and E. So we need to take the 3rd, the C sharp, and we need to drop it down to C. Go down a half step from C sharp down to C. And that gives us our A minor triad, A, C, E. All right? And again, looking at our chord chart, put your fingers back in your A minor form that you have already learned, okay? And let's just check out the notes in this. We've got an open E, we got an open A, we've got an E, we're playing on the D string. We've got another A that we're playing on the G string, up 2 frets. Then we've got a C, we're playing on the B string, up 1 fret. And then we've got an open E again on the top. And that's our A minor chord. And you can see again, we've got our A, our C, and our E, and nothing else. And so we've got a A minor triad, okay? That's it, okay? This is very important stuff that we're going to use in the rest of this course. The next lesson, we're going to do some more chords, and those chords are going to be minor and major variants of the chords we already did, okay? And so that's what we'll do in the next one, and this lesson will help you understand the relationship between those chords as we try to form them on our neck with our guitar, okay? That's it. See you next time.